So today's question is about how I teach replacement behavior. It's interesting because when I think about replacement behavior, there's a lot of things that come up in my mind. And so I'm hoping we can break it apart a little bit so we not only define what we really mean by replacing behavior or replacement behavior, but also we understand all the different degrees of how we show up in having a quote unquote behavior or a reaction or an output. So I'm going to start with the understanding of like behavior management, because I think a lot of times when we think replacement behavior, we think about behavior management as a larger whole. So when we think about the lens in which we show up for students, we've got to keep in mind that it's in the basis of it's student centered. We understand that every kid comes to us not broken, bad, or wrong with their own experiences. We have a very big nervous center system, like our central nervous system that plays a role in how we show up as human, that we rely on predictability and trust, and that belongingness, and especially in school, belongingness is like a necessity we can't live without. Right. I joke about being Mr. Rogers, right? It really kind of gets to this idea that we come to all of these pieces of how we show up and the lens in which we react to students in kind of a basis way to be able to get their central nervous system, their willingness, their motivation, all those pieces to come with us, right? So I'm going to start with that we kind of have this base that we need if we want an output like behavior management, our classrooms to be behavior managed, and for the behavior to be replaced, we have to approach and how we do things in a way that really shows our regulatory state, belongingness, and that predictability piece that so many of us, if not all of us, really need to be able to engage with others. Okay, so that's the base. So we come into it with that lens. When we think about kind of the two big learning modes that our brain takes in, we have this, like some people call it tier one or universal, or kind of the way we learn from others, the unconscious, the mirror neuron piece, the piece that I'm not pulling and thinking about really hard. Just my reaction systems are in play with others, and I learn from that, right? So I think about that as like the social learning basics. So we rely on the kind of the things I've already talked about. Unfortunately, sometimes we rely on patterns that aren't super useful. But a lot of times when we go to navigate that system, when something goes awry, like a behavior that is challenging to us, we go into punishments and rewards. Now, punishments and rewards, that's a valid system of reaction when a child has a skill and is learning in those patterns of social basic learning, right? And so it's for skills they already have or like really close to having. And so when we think about what we're really talking about when we talk about replacement behaviors for most of our kids, when we're having that deep conversation, we're kind of past that piece. Now, what's really interesting is that some of the patterns we use to do rewards and punishments are so predictable, it plays into a need for a kid. And so it gives us kind of a false hope that they're going to work in a way that we want them to work, that doesn't disconnect kids, doesn't feel like they're broken, bad, or wrong, or teach them this really extreme learned helplessness. So we have a lot of unintended consequences when we apply those things when they don't match. So I want us to make sure when we think about replacement behaviors, we know what we're going to get first. So if I'm looking at a student who doesn't have all the skill sets to be able to get the output that we want, the social demand met, or the impact of behavior to go down, whatever the output we need to make sure that we're approaching our strategies to replace or to support a child in their growth in an actual matching strategy. So I am not here to tell you rewards and punishments aren't a match for something. I'm saying most likely you're listening to this because the child's past that kind of social basic learning piece of the unconscious brain, and we're looking to do some more explicit pieces, right? So we have to pay more attention to what we're doing. We're going to have a more intense need here on our end because their need is a little bit more intense on their end, if not extremely larger, right? So when we think about what's our next set of strategies to use, well, we're going to look at explicit instruction. I'm actually going to get into the frontal lobe thinking about this, rationalizing, problem solving, having a ownership in it, and being able to have agency with different pieces. We're going to think about our strategic use of systems. So we might modify or accommodate within a system, and maybe it might be a now, not forever, right? And then we're also going to think about our reaction systems, because no matter what, that unconscious piece is always playing a role. So we've got to be thinking about our explicit piece while knowing that our reaction systems are still going to have a powerful effect on learning as well. So we think about things like plans we make, like behavior intervention plans, or strategies we use, like evidence-based improvement strategies, or we think about some of our common accommodations and our reflection process as adults. These are the common practices we're going to get into when we look to actually replace a behavior. So when we think about our typicals approaching to explicit instruction, we've got the academic thing down. If we see a need, we say, here's the deficit, we find something that matches it, we apply it, we implement, and we check ourselves to make sure we're doing this well, right? But for some reason, the social and emotional skill sets, which has an output we call behavior, right? So the output of not reaching a skill set in academics is like not reading a diphthong. It's like not reading fluently, right? We understand that process. But with behavior, the output is throwing a chair. It might have really large impact. Nobody goes home and goes, I got hit by a diphthong today that somebody didn't read, right? So we don't look at it the same because, well, impact is different. But when we think about how the brain builds structure, a lot of our explicit instructions in academics, because it doesn't happen in that social learning basic piece a lot. It does. It totally does in some of the unconscious learning we do. But we pay attention so quickly to the explicit. I want us to start paying attention to the explicit instruction we can do in social and or emotional skill sets, which the output is behavior. Because right now, most of us try to rely on a system that just doesn't match. It's more intense for the kiddos that we're thinking of, that we're probably listening to this quick bite for, right? And these kids are not broken, bad, or wrong. They are not in full capacity in charge of being able to have the output that we expect. And so that reward and punishment system, no match. So if we stop using the typical pattern we do for behavior, and we start doing the one we do for academics, thinking about, I'm in that next stage. I'm in that I need to explicitly teach. Now we've got the basis of being able to teach a replacement behavior, or have what we want is the output of something different than what wasn't matching to begin with, right? Which is what we're trying to replace, right? So what does that behavior represent is the first stage we have to do when I say, okay, I'm going to think about this more. And now I got to think about, okay, first I've got the reasons why this happens. There's tons of different ways we can get to why, but we've got to figure out why a child is having the output that they're having, right? For a diphthong, it might be because they don't have letter sounds, right? I've got the why. So maybe we see this behavior that we're looking to replace as a coping mechanism, central nervous system reaction. Going to be a totally different path I'm going to take if it's a lagging skill that they're maybe having struggles with. It might be a social skill, a context matching skill. So many skills that could be in that lagging skill that would cause a behavior that is challenging to us that we would look to replace. Right? It could be a communication mode, like a direct communication. I had a student that would bite me to say hi. So people would call that behavior biting, right? But she was saying hi. It was literally a body way of saying hi. It just didn't match well to the context. It hurt. And so my reaction, it would be hard to be able to go, oh, hello, and go back with it. So that direct communication mode, that body was telling me something. That child was telling me something through their body, but it was a direct communication. Or is it us that's actually causing the behavior that is challenging to us? Sometimes we've got environmental barriers, whether it is physical and things within the environment, or it's actually us, like how we react, what we're doing, our systems. So we got to think about that too. What is their body reacting to? What's their experience when we're thinking about replacing? We often go, well, they've got to replace something. Well, wait a second. What are we thinking about that we need to replace? That might be the reason why we're having the loop that we're having. So let's break this down. Let's get it into some steps we can do. First, I got to figure out what the need is. Lots of ways to get there, right? Then we're going to look at what the goal is. If it's an IEP, we might actually break down, get expectations within either the social emotional learning competencies or the Wisconsin Early Learning Standards, right? We'll see where developmentally we need to be or want to be, and then we'll break down. If it's not a child with an IEP, we might be just thinking about, okay, what's my goal? What's my output, right? So if I have this output that I want them to sit in a circle time for 30 minutes, right? Then I'm going to be able to get to why my need, I can't get to that. But you got to understand what you want and make sure it's about the kid, not about us. A well-managed classroom is a beautiful thing. I want that too. But the skill is what we're looking for kid to be able to get and be able to meet that expectation. So once we get that skill, now we have to unpack it. It's not about just sitting. So many skill sets in that one example of sitting on carpet for 30 minutes. So many skill sets it takes to actually be able to physically stay, understand what the staying means, understanding what engagement means, all the different pieces. So I got to unpack to see what is the lagging or missing skill set, or coping barrier, or right. So I'm going to figure out what the skill is, and I'm going to unpack where it is. The example for the communication one would be showing her different modes and helping her practice and go through different modes of saying hi. Right? There's the skill. It's a variety of modes of saying hi. When we think about where we start, we don't start where we want. We start where the kid is at, because you can't make a huge jump. People do not learn by just saying, "Do this. You are going to make it better and be this better." Right? No, that's not. Oh, come on now. That's not how we work. But when you meet a kid where they're at and we go, it's the same path though. I think people are like, "Oh, we're giving in. We're making it too easy." Or we're what we did all these things to say we're just not making them accountable. No, no, no. Accountability is still on my plate. It's still here. I just have a really different path to get there, because there's skill sets that this child didn't develop in a pattern that we expected, that we now have to support. So they have them so we can get to accountability, which is a skill. So when we think about that, like I learned it in the unconscious social basic learning, so many of our kids get a lot of this accountability piece through that system. Some of the times we have to break this down because there's skills missing. There's pieces that are blocking their ability to get to that high level social awareness and skill set. Right? And then we think about what we already have. Sometimes we make this all separate. Sometimes we have to make things separate. That's not what I'm saying. But a lot of times we don't see it in what we already have. So now we've got to pair the pretty product, the material, the strategies we already have, to see what matches, what doesn't match, and then also see, do we need to investigate something further? Okay. So, but that's how you break it down. To actually be able to teach what we're going to call a replacement behavior, we're going to want this child to help meet some of the outside demands that are coming to them, that right now, unfortunately, we're seeing behavior that's challenging to us as a result of not having all these pieces. We've got to teach. So we break it down. So when we think about those two loops, I've got two loops I'm monitoring. My modeling and my feedback loops, that's that unconscious social basic learning, and then my explicit instruction. So you can go with systematic instruction, which is like, I sit down, here's my lesson, it's coming from me to them. I can use embedded instruction, which is I can do things already in the system I already have and just enhance it and have those skill sets be practiced and seen there. And they have naturalistic, where you have a student where their brain is engaged in something and I go to it, and then I pull the learning into that, right? So it's us to them, embedded in system, or them to us, right? Three different really cool modes of being able to teach. It's not all about you come here, I sit here, I tell you. We've got options to be able to do the mode of teaching something and moving a child along. But when you think about that, thinking is required. So we've got to make sure that we are identifying a strategy that actually matches. We implement that strategy, and then we make sure we are navigating the feedback loops that they're getting. Right? Some people like to use the word reinforcement, or which is not an object. It's a system within your body. Okay, so really understand what reinforcement is before you throw the word around. But when we think about that, those loops, are we having these belongingness feelings? Are we having this creative moments or agency moments, those things that really truly create motivation? Or am I just, here we go, I told you to do this, and so you get this, right? So we got to watch where our strategies actually go, and then our loops of reaction. That's why I like positive, explicit a positive praise is so much better than just going, good job, right? You're actually thinking about your feedback loop and applying it directly to what the child is learning. You're coding more. You're getting that child to actually pull up what is something that you might be noticing and helping them notice it too. And that gives some good agency feelings, right? That leads to motivation versus just going, good job, or telling the class, good job, right? It doesn't connect in the way that we want. So our feedback loops become really important. So what are some strategies? People are like, okay, what is the strategy? You talk about what should I teach? Well, I like to think about 6 of the biggest ones that kind of are research-based and hit us a lot. Now, most of these can be high leverage practices. I mean, we'd use it in the social learning big bucket of unconscious learning. Like visuals is a big one. Prompting usually just comes in some of our reaction systems. But when we think about kids with more extensive needs or more intense needs, we might have to explicitly teach some of these pieces. And when we think about the modes that we use, like prompting, we need to make sure we are really following research-based practices, because if we don't, we have the unintended consequence of like kids putting their arm out and just waiting for the coat to put on, right? We get huge learned helplessness. So what I would suggest is not fantastically finding some new strategy or buying some pretty product. Get better at what we already know how to do, right? Let's shine it up. I like to shine it up, right? We don't have to have some new pretty magic wand. There isn't one. But maybe I'm going to look into task analysis. How am I actually breaking this down so a child can problem solve? How am I actually modeling with purpose to give more loops in interactions that I want that child to code, so they can see this pattern and have experiences even though they might not be experiencing them yet themselves? So we get more explicit on it versus just hoping it naturally happens through the ways that we do. So that's step one for thinking about trying to help and actually explicitly teach something, is let's just shine up what we already do. But you want some specific ones. So here we go. How about with the need of coping? We've got tons of different things that help with self-regulation or self-management in the end, like understanding what your body triggers are. That's the first lesson that I would do. Putting language to it. We all jump into teaching actual regulatory practices, which is step 3 in understanding self-management, and then reflection. But if you need a coping, I love actually teaching the central nervous reaction system of breathing. 2 times out, the amount of times in, helps your central nervous system trigger your parasympathetic system, which will help you bring your body down, right? With a caveat, don't tell anybody to breathe. And usually modeling helps a lot. And if you've got a kid with asthma, they might actually have anxiety over breathing. So that might be no match. Remember, thinking's required, right? But if we're looking at actually doing breathing, it's not like, let's practice breathing. Let's actually technically tell them what breathing does with your central nervous system. Because if they have a need of a hyperactive stress response system, hopefully we're helping them understand that. And then this will have a place to live, so that when they get hyped up, they might actually have a way to trigger the breathing actually happening versus somebody always having to be there to help them trigger into breathing. What if it's a skill deficit? So let's say we have a child who really struggles with executive functioning pieces and they get frustrated, and so we have a blow up. We have a behavior that's challenging to us. But really it's because they got confused. They didn't know the pattern. They thought they were lost, right? All the different reasons that we get upset because we didn't have the concept of what was going on. So I love, it really is the basis of the research around scripting, but creating like a cognitive prosthetic that is like a script of how I manage through an outside demand. So like a teacher asked me to do something. Well, I need to ask myself, okay, what am I being asked to like to do? Like, what are the things I can do? And then what am I noticing about what I'm doing, right? Does it match, right? That reflective piece. So we give them a prepare, follow, question sequence so that they can rely on that to be able to, in task analysis or script out what is actually the demand. This is actually kind of a combination of in task analysis as the result. That's what they're going to do. They're going to break things down, right? But they're going to do it through the use of a script. So when we think about some of the evidence-based practices that'll help us help replace the behavior, we're looking at what's the skill set that's not here, not it's lagging, it's not unmet. Well, maybe being able to actually suss out what's there, and so we get frustrated, and all these other emotions come to it because we didn't have this skill. So we teach the skill, so hopefully frustration will go down. When we think about communication modes, what you see on the screen is not an all-encompassing list, but some of the skill sets when you have a child who is communicating in an alternative way, or their communication looks like a behavior that's challenging to us, right? Because it is communication, but we need to listen, right? That's the other part of this. So what you see on the screen is a breakdown of some of the skill sets and some of the things we can do to be able to vary up mode, right? So I had the child who would bite me in the arm, right, to say hi. So we actually did a different gesture, and we did high five. So we put something so that I could stop having a hurt reaction because it hurt, and that's very hard to not naturally feel like you're hurt. And then we start to modify the actual motion. So she'd come out, she'd get all excited, her mouth would be open, and we would try to get a hand to a high five as much as possible. Now I only had her 3 years, so we only got to a high five by the end. But I'm hoping they kept going and look to see some of these other expression modes that you see on the screen right now of how to vary up communication. So her skill set was a variety of communication modes to express her wants and needs and thoughts. And so we were looking to explicitly teach that through different gestures and hand motions. So that's an example of one that if it was a communication mode, that was a barrier. And then I'm going right back to the Mr. Rogers things, because when we think about it's us, I really think if we just look at these three buckets, we make it more complicated than it needs to be sometimes. Let's just think about it. Where am I connecting with kid? How am I being predictable? And am I regulated? So when we think about am I or is my system the barrier, I'm going to check myself on those three things so that I can make sure I am giving the basis of a child's brain engaging in what we're doing. Because if you're disconnected from a person, you're not going to do much learning. You can't predict what they're going to do. You spend so much time trying to predict what they're going to do. If that person's dysregulated, you become dysregulated. So when we think about, I want to replace this behavior, and oh my gosh, I think maybe the system is the reason why we're getting the behavior. Let's just start with these three simple things. So when we look to the question of how do I replace this behavior, okay, first you need to know what you need from the expectation that you have, right? So let's get that down. Then we're going to break down, unpack what the actual skill set is within that. We're going to start where the kid is at, and then we're going to bring in whatever we have, right, to be able to support the learning of the need and the skill that we identified. I'm hoping this helped you out. I know there is no magic wand. Everybody wants a magic wand, but if there was one, it would be a whole different world. It really is just getting back to the basics of what we already know and shining it up and getting better at it. So, hope that answered your question. And that is my answer to how do we teach replacement behaviors.